Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So today marks actually 1 month that I've owned the Canon EOS R5, and yeah, there's definitely some things to talk about. Now, if this is your guys' first time to my channel, I try to make content trying to help other creators, and one of the ways I do that is obviously talking about the cameras and the gear that I use. Now, I've been using the R5 pretty much exclusively since the first day I got it, so if you guys want to see a lot of examples of what the images out of this look like, feel free to check out any of the videos that I put out in the past month because they were all shot using this camera right here, but I'm definitely going to splice in some footage and things like that throughout this video as well. So in this video, I kind of wanted to give you guys like a 1 month review of this camera. This isn't going to be like a crazy deep dive into like Gerald Undone testing or a bunch of specs and things like that. I think by now everybody knows all the specs, a lot of things going on with this camera. Some of those things being issues, which we'll definitely touch on here, but I plan on talking about all the things I like about this camera, the things I've really enjoyed about it so far, and then also I want to talk about the things that I dislike about it and some of the problems that I've ran into with this. Oh, and also as I'm filming this video right now, a couple days ago, Canon released the first firmware update of this camera, which have changed things a little bit, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and also maybe we'll talk a little bit about what my future plans are for this camera as well. So let's start out with the things that I really like and what I enjoy about this camera. I personally think the images coming out of this camera look absolutely amazing for both photos and videos. If you guys didn't know, I really would like to have kind of like a perfect all-in-one camera, which is definitely what drew me to the R5 originally. I don't think there's any argument that the 8K looks amazing, the 4K HQ looks amazing, but I'm not really interested in using those because I don't really want to ever touch anything that does any overheating, which trust me, we'll talk about the overheating in a minute. So mostly when I've been using it, I just use like the normal 4K, which I think looks still absolutely amazing. I think it looks crisp. I think it looks great. And that 4K 120 looks honestly amazing. And for anybody who says it doesn't look sharp, I don't know. I kind of call bullshit because I think it looks great. And honestly, YouTube compression, I don't know. I think it's hard to tell the sharpness difference when you're like pixel peaking. So I don't know. I think the image looks great out of this. So the colors out of this camera look amazing, and this isn't like a, oh, Canon's colors are better than Sony, anything like that. I'm just saying the colors straight out of the camera do look great. I was impressed by the dynamic range, and even if they do bring out C-Log, what is it, 2 or C-Log 3, I think it's just gonna improve that dynamic range. The Ibis can be really good if you're shooting some B-roll of products and you're trying to get some smoother shots. Honestly, the Ibis in this thing is really strong. Whether that is completely good or bad, maybe we'll talk about that here in a second, again for the dislikes, but the Ibis can be really great in certain situations. It looks awesome. Another thing that I think is great about this camera is it has a lot of different recording modes, so you can shoot things in all-eye, you can shoot things in IPB, and apparently they're working on another firmware update that's going to maybe even put in more options for lower bit rates and everything like that. But there's a big debate kind of between the all-eye and the IPB, and I feel like before this camera, everybody just thought all-eye must be higher quality because the file sizes are bigger, but the more research has kind of gone into it, it seems like it's more of a compression thing. And honestly, what I've been filming most of my videos in is just the normal 4K in the IPB format because it lets me get 3 times the recording time as the all-eye if I'm shooting in the IPB mode. I think it looks great. I do enjoy the fact that they do have some different recording options. One little small thing that I think is great on this camera, you know, there's 2 card slots on this camera. You have the CF Express and then also the normal SD. So one thing that you can do is actually have all of the videos go to the CF Express, which is usually going to be your larger files, and then you can have all your photos go to the SD card. What I do enjoy is being able to separate my photos from my videos, which that's kind of nice that you can do that in this. The autofocus is amazing on this camera. I love the autofocus on the R and the RP, but the eye detection, everything, I think it's super reliable, it's super quick, and I don't even really have to think about if something is gonna be in focus or not. So yeah, no complaints with the autofocus. Another thing I really enjoy about this camera, and honestly just about the whole Canon mirrorless line, is going to be the body design. So just the way they kind of laid out all the buttons, the screen on the top, and then now with certain things like the mic button, or the mic port, I should say, up here doesn't get in the way of the articulating screen like it did on the R, so you can put the mic in there. This just moves around perfectly. It doesn't get in the way. Honestly, just the body design of this camera, I could not get over how good it felt in the hand, which sounds stupid, but when you're holding something for hours, all the little things really do add up. I think the Canon mirrorless lines with an RF lens on it is hands down the best looking cameras on the market. And honestly, just the overall usability of this camera is just so nice. If you need to switch between modes real quick, or if you need to switch between one codec to the next, or if you need to find something in the menu, it really is easy to do. That's one thing that I think Canon has had for a long time, is that their menus and just the usability of them is just super simple and it's really quick. So I think those are kind of like the main majority of all the things that I've really enjoyed about this camera so far. I get excited to pick this camera up every single time I'm using it, which I think is important if it's a personal camera. It's different for me when you're like on set and you're trying to just have the best tool for that job, and you're using like a Red or an ARRI or like an FX9 or a C200, whatever. For me, if I'm going to create something here in my office or in my free time or on my weekend, I want to be excited about picking up that camera, and that does go a long way for me at the end of the day, because if you're not excited to use the gear or the equipment you have, sometimes you might not be as eager to kind of pick it up and start creating. All right, so as much as there are things that I love about this camera, there are definitely some downsides to it and some things that I dislike. So let's go ahead and talk about those. The one obvious one that I'm just going to say, but maybe we'll talk about here a little bit more in a second, is the overheating. It is a pretty big problem. Like, it actually pisses me off, because if that wasn't an issue, this could probably be the dream camera for me. But yeah, we'll talk about that more in a second. But the overheating, it is an actual problem. It really is. Another thing I dislike about this camera is that there's still a 30-minute record time on this camera. Obviously, you know, you can just hit record again and it'll keep rolling. But especially if I'm recording something like this, where I usually film honestly for like about an hour or sometimes even over, I wish I could just hit the record button and forget about it. But you always have to kind of be watching how much time you have left, stop recording, re-record, everything like that. And obviously, when you're out in the real world doing interviews with other people or weddings, other situations, there's definitely times that you just want to hit the record and just let it roll. Another dislike I have, which is something that I talked about earlier in another video, is going to be the Ibis wobble. Now, it's kind of interesting because I was watching the Potato Jet video where it was like him and Armando comparing the A7S III to the R5, and he was just saying that the Ibis wobble is gone after the update and everything. I actually strongly disagree. A lot of times I'm filming on the 15 to 35. I love vlogging all the way out at 15, which is super wide. And I'm well aware that it's a common issue having a very wide lens. With Ibis, a lot of times you kind of get that wobble and that warping effect, but this camera doesn't allow you just to turn it off or anything like that. So there was a firmware update for the 15 to 35 lens, which then if you turn off the image stabilization on the lens, it will turn off the Ibis in the camera, which I have tested that out, and it gets rid of the Ibis wobble. But then you lose not only Ibis, but you also lose the image stabilization on the lens, which is kind of the entire purpose of having this nice and this expensive of a lens. So I don't know, maybe in the future Canon will let you turn off Ibis just in the camera, that way you could maybe still use it in the lens. That would be really nice. Or maybe just Potato Jet and Armando figure something else out. But with my experience so far, the firmware update on the lens, and then now even with the firmware update in the camera, the 1.1, it still looks really bad in my opinion. Now I do want to say that the 120 frames per second in this camera, although it does look amazing, there are a couple of downsides to it, especially compared to Sony 120 frames per second. One is you don't get any audio whenever you record 120 frames, which for me, I don't really run into a big problem with that very often, but there have been some situations when I was filming with other people that I either missed something or I had to be like, can you repeat that, and switch over to a mode that does offer audio. Another thing, that when you record in 120 frames per second, the file that it's recorded as is a 30 frames per second file, and you can't control that, so you can't make it 23.976. It just spits it out at 30 frames per second. So it just kind of adds another step. So whenever you put it into your computer and to whatever your editing program, you then have to basically interpret that footage from 30 frames per second to 23.976. So it just kind of adds another step. So let's talk a little bit about how computers handle the footage of this camera. and I definitely have some strong thoughts about this. Okay, so the files currently coming out of this camera are H.265 files, which right now is a nightmare on pretty much any type of computer, any type of GPU. And I've heard that for both people that are using Macs and also people that are using Windows. The one kind of workaround that I've seen in a video is actually on the newer iPad Pros. For whatever reason, the new Apple chip just flies through H.265. So a lot of people are saying in the next version of the Mac computers, once they put in their own silicone chip, that it's just going to fly through them. And I'm sure NVIDIA and different companies are gonna be working on that for the Windows side of things. It's just not really optimized yet, and this doesn't allow you to shoot anything in an H.264 format, which is like the more common one that's been out for a while, which kind of computers are used to at this point. So I have a pretty powerful MacBook Pro. It usually can fly through pretty much any footage, especially 4K footage, before this camera and these type of files. So let me explain like what my current workflow is, right? So I shoot, let's say, just a normal video with this. So it's mostly 4K, regular 24 frames per second footage, and then I'll usually shoot a couple, B-roll shots, let's say in 120 frames per second, or maybe even a couple in 60 frames per second as well. You load in all your footage to Premiere Pro just like normal. Your computer can't handle the H.265 files yet, so you have to create proxies. But before you do that, you wanna make sure you interpret your 60 frames per second footage and also your 120 frames per second footage that spits it out as 30 frames per second, so all your files match up to be 23.976. Proxies are a little bit annoying because I can't just start editing right away. A lot of times I just have to sit and let my computer do all those different proxies for either like an hour, maybe two, depending on how much I shot, but it's not too bad if you know that's what you have to expect, so you can kind of work around it. Whew, I gotta cool off for a second. I get heated talking about that, but speaking of heating, let's talk about the overheating. Now, I think by now everybody knows that the overheating on the R5 is a giant issue. Now, I was somebody who I was like, it probably isn't really that bad. Will it really affect my workflow? Everything like that. And for the most part, I would say I used it for most of this month, like the first 2 or 3 weeks specifically, without running into any issues with my workflow and how I was shooting with this camera. Now, currently I'm not doing any big projects or like traveling a bunch or doing a bunch of things outside with other people, just with everything going on. So a lot of times I'll either be vlogging where I'm just shooting, a couple minute clips at a time. And then a good amount of my videos is kind of like this. So I'll kind of do like a sit down interview style video where, I talk to the camera for, I would say usually around an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And then while everything's fresh in my mind that I just talked about, I like shooting the B-roll just right then. So the other day I did exactly that. So I recorded my talking head stuff just like this in the normal 4K mode. So that's one of the modes that doesn't overheat, so didn't have to worry about that at all. Everything went smooth, so I finished that. Then I kind of started setting things up to shoot my B-roll, switched the camera over to 120 frames per second, and there it was. For the first time that I saw it on my camera, it overheated. And I was not able to record even 1 second of 120 frames per second, even though I was recording in a mode that doesn't overheat. So even if you're recording in a mode that doesn't overheat, it's affecting how much time you have left to record in the modes that do overheat. I switched it over to 60 frames per second, and that mode was overheated as well. So with that current situation, I had to basically just leave my camera sitting there for like a couple hours for it to get enough back for me to be able to shoot multiple clips of a higher frame rate. So right then and there, I was, furious, okay? I was furious, and I think that's understandable because I didn't really do anything that was very taxing on my camera. And that's something that would affect a lot of things I do, especially, what if I was filming outside? Like just instantly, you would never be able to shoot anything that was 4K at least at a higher frame rate. Maybe if they'll add in like 120 frames per second in 1080p, maybe then it will be okay, but yeah, that's not good at all. And then as of a couple days ago, Canon released the firmware update 1.1. And actually Jared Pullen put out a really good video, and basically his testings outside, there was no difference at all, but he did see a lot of increase in the recording times when he was inside. So take that for what you will, and I suggest you guys to check out his video. I'll try to link it below, but I wanted to do a little bit of testing for myself. So I tried to basically do exactly what I did the other day when it overheated for me. So with me trying to replicate that with the new firmware update in this camera, I filmed this for an hour, and it actually allowed me to have 5 minutes left at 4K 120 frames per second. 2 hours into filming, it allowed me to have 3 minutes left. Now, I don't think I would ever film any more than 2 hours straight of talking head. So when it said I had 3 minutes left at 120 frames per second, if I wanted to film, I basically tried to do a couple burst shootings in that 120 frames per second mode. So I did about 6 bursts of 120 frames per second, ranging between like 30 seconds to 60 seconds at a time, because I think that's kind of more realistic for me, what I would actually record and what I would actually be doing. And after doing that, it allowed me to have only 27 seconds left of overheating. So yeah, not great. Those are my results, so kind of take that for what you will. And although I think this firmware update is a step in the right direction, and it definitely has increased recording times and things like that, it might give you a little bit more peace of mind. But I'm telling you, whenever you're filming on this camera or you're planning on shooting something, it's in the back of your mind. If it's going to overheat, do you need to shoot something 120 frames per second now instead of later so it isn't overheated by the time you need to do it? Let me give you guys a little analogy here, okay? This is something I was thinking about and it makes perfect sense, at least in my mind. Now, I'm a big basketball guy. I don't know if you guys can tell from my office. I'm definitely big into basketball. I'm big into sneakers. The key to finding a good pair of basketball shoes is when you forget that they're even on your feet when you're playing. So you're focused on playing, your shoes aren't just clunking around, they're not too heavy, you forget that they're even there. Now, if you have a pair of shoes that are heavy or clunky or aren't the right size, the entire time you're playing, you're thinking about your shoes and you aren't focused on actually playing basketball. The shoe analogy carries over exactly to the camera in my mind. Your camera is supposed to be the extension of your hand, your mind, your eye. You just want to create something, you know how to create it once you learn your camera inside and out. Well, the R5 is that heavy, clunky shoe that the entire time you're playing, you're thinking about, because whenever you're shooting with this camera, that is always on your mind. Is this camera getting hot? Am I running into its limitations? Am I hurting the camera? Is it not going to do what I need it to? And you can't focus on just shooting. And for me, that's a problem. It really is. So those are some of my thoughts about this camera, guys. You know, I'm not sure exactly if I'm going to keep this and hope that Canon kind of fixes some of these things, or if I'm just going to either try to return this or sell this and just stick with my R for now. Or maybe I even try to switch systems to something else. I think this is a lot of information to unpack. And this video is probably gonna be pretty long, but I'm just gonna let it be long because I want to just leave all this information in there for anybody else who's curious about the R5 or they're thinking about picking up the R5 in the future. I think if you're shooting just photos and maybe just a couple times a month or whenever you're gonna shoot video as well, this camera would be perfect because it is an amazing photo camera, like amazing photo camera. But some of the marketing of this camera, how it's a dream filmmaker's camera, all this stuff, and currently it's just not. I will say, regardless of what I do, you need to find a camera that fits your workflow the best and what you're actually going to be using it for. So guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Definitely be on the lookout because I'm sure I'll be putting out a video when I kind of make my decision. I feel like LeBron or something, but it is a big decision because whatever camera I kind of buy right now is probably what I'm going to be using for the next, at least like 2 or 3 years, I would think, until kind of like the next generation of cameras come out. So hopefully Canon can work some magic on this thing and make this great because it has potential to be a phenomenal camera. Let me know in the comments below what your current thoughts are on the R5. Do you think this camera is amazing? Do you think this camera is trash? Did you cancel your pre-order? Or maybe you have one and you absolutely love it. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. But guys, that's gonna be it for today's video. I need to stop rambling. If you did enjoy today's video, will you drop it a thumbs up? That really helps the channel out. If you're new around here, consider hitting that sub button. I'd really appreciate it. I try to make content, trying to help other creators create better looking content. That is a mouthful. My name is Johnny. I will see you guys in the next video. Maybe talking about the decision on this very, very soon. See you guys.